Hey Nick, thanks for joining us today. How's things?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Now, just to jump right into it, we've been asking our guests about their journey into early education. Are you able to share what brought you to the place of early learning?
Yeah, sure. So I started working in industrial relations back in the 90s, which is a little while ago. So effectively, my whole career is industrial relations, and part of that career was working in the early learning sector in the mid 2000s, where
Yep.
I worked for the Victoria's peak body in early childhood, Early Learning Association of Australia, as their industrial relations advisor. So that was my first connection with the early childhood sector. And I've maintained that over the last 5 years, particularly through that peak body, but also through the opening of my own dedicated consultancy, EC Workplace,
Wow. Yep.
to service early childhood services in Victoria, whether they be the not-for-profit sector, primarily kindergartens, or the for-profit sector, long daycare centres. Um, yes, I've been doing that since 2019.
What was the name of your consultancy again? Sorry.
EC Workplace.
EC Workplace.
Yeah, EC for early childhood. Not very
Oh,
imaginative, but
workplace. Yeah, it makes sense. That's
yeah.
fantastic. And look, so what we're going to do is obviously, you're an expert in industrial relations, and now given the last 5 years with your knowledge of the sector, and I'm sure through that time was COVID, right? So it's been an
Indeed.
interesting, probably an interesting journey for you. So what we're going to do is talk about responsibilities and obligations for early learning service providers, owners, managers.
Hmm.
And go from there. So in our planning episode, we talked a lot about reportable conduct, workplace bullying, etc. Are you able to provide us an overview of what this language means?
Sure, not a problem. So we'd all probably be familiar with the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. Now, following that, in 2019, there were a set of national principles agreed to for child safe standards, essentially, to be implemented across Australia. So in Victoria, where I'm talking to you from, we have a mandatory reportable conduct scheme in that child safe space, which is overseen by a statutory body, the Commission for Children and Young People. Now, I'm aware that there's similar schemes in some other states, while some other states are still in the process of implementing such schemes. For example, I think Queensland is in the process of implementing a scheme as we speak, whereas New South Wales is a couple of steps ahead. But essentially, that's where those child safe standards come from, that Royal Commission, which basically, with child safe standards, is placing obligations on any early childhood service, plus other services with children, of course, particularly for the context of today, early childhood services having those mandatory obligations to report any alleged or suspected breaches of child safe standards.
Wow. So even though you're in Victoria,
Mm.
the knowledge that you have could apply really broadly across Australia anyway. Like if someone's
Well,
listening
indeed.
from another state, they can take on some of the obviously the topic is relevant to everywhere.
Mm.
So they're able to take on that, take what you're saying at a broader level anyway.
Well, indeed. I mean, from my own point of view, I think the child safe standards that have been implemented have been, and a lot of organisations have been following those principles already. So it's really effectively casting the net wider as far as those obligations on those settings to ensure the safety of our children. So, from that perspective, responding to any allegations in the workplace effectively would be a similar response, doesn't, regardless of which state you are in, from the perspective of the response must be done in a procedurally fair manner to both the person making the allegation, the person on the receiving end of the allegation, remembering that at the centre of that is a child.
Yes.
But very, very important from an investigative point of view when investigating such allegations that it is done in a procedurally fair manner and one that effectively could be open to scrutiny. Because, of course, everyone has rights in these processes. But, of course, the overarching theme here is to ensure that we have workplaces and early childhood settings where we have children in a safe sort of manner.
So, what would be some of those things that are procedurally fair, I suppose? Is there anything that you would like to share that to tell someone, hey, if you're even thinking this is happening, this is what you should do first? Is there anything that any tips that you can
Mm,
share with us to help
sure,
an owner or a proof provider or a manager that's listening? Because
sure. Yeah.
I'm sure our audience, someone's probably may have it already in their head that something's not right. What do I do? What should I do? What's my obligations? But how
Mm.
do I do it well, or how do I do it procedurally fair?
Indeed. I mean, I think the key first step is to seek advice from your relevant peak body. Most early childhood services out there would be a member of a particular or respective peak body. So that's probably the first port of call, to ensure that you're seeking that advice, and then potentially a connection with somebody such as myself who is trained and experienced in responding to such allegations in a procedurally fair manner, which is demanded by these mandatory schemes. And within those mandatory schemes, there are reporting obligations as well. So to ensure that services are responding to those obligations
Is there
as
something we shouldn't do?
um, I think the key message there is, one of the things I've seen is you can have all the goodwill in the world, and an owner, or even a director, so effectively an employee or a senior manager on the floor, will respond to such allegations in a sense that they're taking it very seriously, and with all the goodwill in the world, they will commence their own process. Inadvertently, a lot of the time, however, not doing it in a procedurally fair manner. So it's not as if it's coming from um, a, a place of unprofessionalism or anything like that. It's usually
The
with
opposite.
all the goodwill in the world,
Yeah.
but a procedurally fair process is demanded in such responses, and there are certain elements of that, or elements of a procedurally fair process, that are not negotiable, and
And
any professionals will know how to implement.
so with that, I'm a centre director or an owner, and I've got an idea that something is not quite right. Is
Yep.
there, with regarding to that workplace bullying, you don't really get the police involved at at a point, do you? Like, is there a point where you would call the police?
Uh, Sorry, you mentioned workplace bullying there. Are we still talking about reportable conduct, or?
Reportable conduct. Sorry, yeah, reportable
Yep.
conduct. Yeah,
Sure,
yeah,
sure, because workplace
yeah,
bullying is a
yeah.
different
No, you're
area.
right. Sorry.
Yes, indeed, reportable conduct is. You raise a very good point. In most cases, such allegations are referred to the police in the first instance. The police will do their own investigation, and somebody such as me, conducting a workplace investigation essentially into such allegations, that cannot occur until the police have finished their process. So they have
Ah,
precedence in these processes. So I will
yeah,
never commence an investigation into an allegation of reportable conduct until I have clearance from, in my
right.
case, Victoria Police.
Yeah, because what I'm trying to give our audience is that what should I do first? What should I do first? And do if it's obviously of a serious nature, the police should be called. If it's just my what do I do? How do I react? Maybe, like you said, call your peak body, get some advice around what you've noticed.
Mm.
But the biggest thing I'm taking away from it is don't just jump into your own investigation.
Well, that's right, absolutely. And as I was touching on before, that's usually motivated by goodwill.
Yes,
So it's coming from a good place, so to speak. But I suppose in the colloquial, I would say, slow down, get some advice.
that's really the best part of it, isn't it? Is just to stop, get advice, and then follow that advice.
Yeah, basically, yes.
Okay, fantastic. So that's with reportable contact. And is it a similar process around workplace bullying, or is it what would you recommend with the workplace bullying?
Look, again, most early childhood services would be a member of a peak body who would provide industrial relations advice, which is what seeking advice about workplace bullying would come under. So again, it is a really simple message of get some advice. If you are in a situation where one of your employees, whether that be, it could be an early childhood teacher, it could be an educator, has made an allegation against another worker, or it might be against a manager. They're the sort of common scenarios that we see. And again, it's about getting advice and responding in a procedurally fair manner, because I suppose, to put it sort of in simple terms, just because somebody makes an allegation doesn't mean it's true.
That's
However,
right. It's all perspective, right?
on the flip side, I have seen up close, very close, the effects of workplace bullying on the health and safety of workers, and it can be quite significant. So again, it all comes back to the fact that when we have such allegations, what do? We seek advice, but most importantly, respond in a procedurally fair manner, because such responses by employers can ultimately be scrutinised, whether that be at Fair Work Commission or it might be through a workers' compensation claim. And if there is any missteps in a process, that can be a real issue as far as resolution is concerned.
Yeah. So if I was the one who was feeling like I was bullied,
Mm-hmm.
what would your advice be to me?
To certainly let the employer know and make a complaint, effectively, is the way it would usually start, which would be a complaint in the worker's own words to their employer. They may be represented by a union as well. Um, and then once that complaint is made, that triggers obligations on the part of the employer to respond.
Right. And so I could actually have someone with me as part of that complaint
Oh,
process.
absolutely. All workers are entitled to workplace representation, whether that be, in a dispute with their employer or in raising concerns with their employer. They have a right to that representation.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things when you're with workplace bullying and making that complaint,
Mm.
should all workplaces have a procedure
Yes,
set in
yes,
place for complaints?
yes, absolutely. The short answer is yes. And those procedures will usually come from two areas. And one is certainly recommended and one is usually there anyway. The first is through policy, having a proper complaints policy at the workplace to ensure that everybody is aware of how an employer is to respond to such complaints and the rights and obligations of all in such a process. However, usually the relevant, what we call in industrial relations language, industrial instrument, so we're talking the award, but most likely the enterprise agreement, whether that be a multi-employer agreement or a single enterprise agreement,
Yes.
will include a grievance procedure, will include a dispute settlement procedure as well. So it's effectively referencing those elements of an enterprise agreement as well as the relevant policy. In some states, it will be mandatory to have a complaints policy as well, and that
And that should be accessible. It,
absolutely, absolutely, and most workers would sign on to receipt of policies when they start their employment. Most early childhood services and best practice would include, annual reminders of obligations to policy and relevant education around those.
wow. Yeah, no, it's such an important message, isn't it? Because I know it's easy for us to sit here and say and do, but when
Mm,
it's that person who feels like they've been bullied or, or even the one that's been alleged of reportable conduct and things like that, there's there's a trauma associated with that, of course.
well, indeed, and let's take that one step further. With trauma, effectively, we're talking triggering all sorts of emotions with these allegations, and that's normal from a human perspective to have such emotional reactions when we have children in the mix as well. So, but also the emotion of the worker who's potentially experiencing workplace bullying when we're talking about that. It
Yes.
all emphasises what I suppose we've touched on a couple of times today, the importance of procedural fairness and making sure we have a process that is not affected by emotion, is around the evidence. Because effectively, what somebody like me does is when there is an allegation, whether it's in the reportable conduct area or whether it's in the workplace bullying area, the ultimate outcome of any investigation is driven by evidence or lack thereof.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, with reportable conduct, could you give me some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah, sure. So under the Victorian scheme, it's defined in five particular areas. And I, dare say this is where other states, if they're not already there, will end up, because remembering this comes from a national agreement to implement national principles. So we're talking about alleged sexual offences committed against, with, or in the presence of a child, sexual misconduct committed against, with, or in the presence of a child. So we've got offences there and misconduct, two separate areas. Physical violence against, with, or in the presence of a child. Any behaviour that causes significant emotional or psychological harm to a child, and significant neglect of a child. So any allegation that fits any of those is effectively, again, from the Victorian perspective, there is an obligation to report, and we will sooner rather than later we will see that obligation in all states. Having said that, any such allegation, regardless of whether or not there was a reportable conduct scheme in place, should be reported. And you mentioned the police. You mentioned the police before. That is always an obvious port of call as well if such allegations are made.
Yeah, and also, I suppose with that, the person reporting can be anyone who's employed or at that service, right? It doesn't
Correct.
have to be whoever it is has that obligation to report. Whoever views it, sees it, witnesses it, whatever
Correct.
it is,
Yes.
regardless of your role at the service.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, fantastic. It's just been really nice to have a really clear picture. And that's what I'm trying to do for our audience is get that really clear picture because, like we talked about, that trauma can actually impact what people are going to do, even though it might be goodwill, it could be, whatever it's coming from. But just to know, step back and actually contact the right authorities or the right bodies to assist you in this, regardless of your role in it.
Well, that's right. Absolutely.
Look, the other thing, you've spent a lot of time helping services with allegations of workplace bullying. How do you typically become involved?
Yeah, great question. Look, at the Victorian level, I'm often referred queries from the peak body, so Early Learning Association of Australia, and also I have direct queries as well through my own website, so EC Workplace. I'm fairly well networked in the sector in Victoria, but effectively through those two avenues would be the sort of main port of call where I would first come in to respond to such a query.
Wow. No, thank you for that. Look, and what's important, I suppose, if anyone is listening here today that feels like they've been impacted or is this triggering something for them, they should really reach out, even to you, and we'll share those details, of course, through the podcast, Nick, because, obviously we've got a broad audience, and I certainly don't know what everyone's feeling or being involved in at the moment. So please, if anyone is out there who needs Nick's help, please contact him through the details on our page or on our website or on Nick's website, or just to have that support and help from that. And my last thing regarding this is, if someone was listening right now, what takeaways would you want to stay with them? What's the things, maybe 3 or 4 really important things to remember, or the main important thing?
Sure. Look, I've jotted down a few points in response to this question because, we're talking about some fairly serious territory here, so it's probably some very serious sort of takeaways from this. And at the risk of repetition, and I know it sounds like that, but it's really important to emphasise. So when we're talking about allegations, whether it be reportable conduct or workplace bullying, just touching on what we were talking about before, these are traumatic and challenging for all involved, and obviously not least the employer. So it's really important to remember that for all involved, and especially the person making the allegation and the person accused, but we've also got potential witnesses as well, that there needs to be a fair process. And actually, it's a legal requirement to have a fair process, and I've been using that phrase, procedurally fair process. And that is an absolute legal obligation, because if any outcome was ever challenged in the courts, that's one thing would be examined, and a question that would need to be crossed, so to speak, as a hurdle is, was the investigation that led to such an outcome conducted in a procedurally fair manner? Okay, so that's why we recommend the use of licensed investigators. So I'm a licensed workplace investigator in Victoria, an experienced industrial relations professional, and I would say especially with a relevant industry experience well, so that you've got the knowledge of the industry, you know the language of the industry, you know the obligations. I have a very good relationship with the respective unions in the industry, which we work closely with when we're responding to such matters. So they would be my key takeaways, and I suppose all circling back to that key phrase that we've touched on a couple of times before: seek advice.
Seek advice and procedurally fair is a legal requirement.
Correct.
Look, just something we haven't touched on. We have is what about the child that is either a witness, being part of, or abused as part of that, either workplace bullying or the
Yep.
reportable conduct? Because I figure if
Great
there's
question.
workplace bullying, a child may have viewed that. What would you what I could imagine is, once again, out of the goodness of someone's heart, they could tell a parent.
Well, indeed. Well, look, in relation to reportable conduct, which we're touching on there, children are at the centre of the ensuring the response is done in a manner that adheres to those child safe principles that we've been um, uh, focusing on before or touched on before. So, practically, for example, when I'm doing an investigation into alleged reportable conduct, we are working with the parents. We're interviewing the parents, if possible, and if obviously only subject to agreement of the parents or guardian, the child may be interviewed. But yeah, it is very child centric. It is very much involving the parents as well. Parents under the relevant legislation have rights as far as knowing the outcome of the process and the reasonings behind findings in such investigations. So yes, it's a great question, and it's something that is, I really think, came from that Royal Commission to ensure that any responses to such allegations are done not only in a procedurally fair manner that we've touched on several times, but also in a child safe and child centric manner, remembering the potential seriousness of what we're dealing with when we have that initial allegation.
Yeah, and so from that, if I was an educator that I saw something happen to another child, but I saw a child experience the trauma of viewing that, it's not really my role then to tell a parent either
Oh,
what to follow the procedure, the incident
mm,
reporting from
sure,
a
sure.
trauma perspective. Of course, then that would be the employer, the owner, the
Yeah.
investigator, whoever it is, then takes that responsibility of
Yes,
informing
yes.
parents.
Yes, you're right. It comes back to, who has control of the business, basically, which is effectively the employer. I think the audience would be fairly familiar with the duty of care concept, both common law and statutory. So all roads lead to the employer as far as responsibility is concerned,
Yeah,
which is why we're talking about, proper policy and procedures as far as
absolutely.
responses are
So
concerned, but
really,
also
what we
getting that
need to say
advice.
here, yeah. So really, an educator who should not take it upon themselves to tell a parent.
No, no, no.
Follow due process.
To follow due process, I mean, it may be that the educator may well be involved in the investigation. Absolutely, they may be a person of interest. But as
Absolutely.
far as communicating with the parent, that would be the responsibility of the employer. Um,
No,
yeah,
fair enough. No, that's fantastic because that's what's really important, isn't it? Because quite often in the moment where something's happened, we in the goings about of our work and our life at a service, we
mm,
don't expect to see things like that. Most people
no,
in their workplace don't expect. It's not. Thankfully, it's not commonplace.
no, it's not. No, it's not common.
Thankfully,
And that's
yeah,
that's really important to mention, I think, because by the in the main, our early childhood services, both workers and management are doing a great job out there under a lot of stress day to day. Um,
yeah,
and I think we need to remember the great work that is done in our sector. However, from time to time there may be something that goes on that is not right, whether that be minor to potentially very significant, as we've been touching on with the reportable conduct matters, which is why, again, we have policies, procedures, statutory obligations that provide that framework for our response.
yeah, yeah. Because it is. I mean, I can imagine being an educator who doesn't expect it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I better tell the wrong person. You can make a wrong decision if you're not thinking, because we don't see it in that way. So that's what's really
Well,
important.
indeed, indeed, and remembering, and I think this is important to mention, whoever is on the receiving end of that allegation has the presumption of innocence.
Yes, yes,
Now, it is very important that we have child-centric and a system that is based on fundamental belief. However, there are still legal processes and the presumption of innocence of the person who is accused that is non-negotiable in a procedurally fair process, which is why an investigator such as myself will not be driven by emotion, will be driven by evidence or lack thereof, because that's the obligation to all involved. And I have certainly seen allegations that have led to not substantiated due to lack of evidence. And I've seen the opposite as well. But I think one of the key things about a procedurally fair process is not only responding to obligations, but giving everybody a sense that it's been fair,
yes,
wherever the outcome may end up.
yeah. And once again, it's following, like you said, just don't don't jump in and do something. Just stop and talk to the manager, the approved provider, whoever it is
Yes,
that your safe person to go to,
yes.
um, that can help as well, because we need to make good choices at that point.
Well, indeed, very, very, very important.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Nick. Is there anything else that we've missed that you think you guys need to know this? We've got to get this out. This is what I see that goes wrong all of the time.
Look, I think probably some of the key takeaways are really here as you know these recent implementation of child safe standards. Whilst always there's been obligations for employers to respond to such allegations, really emphasises both in a statutory and also a cultural sense the importance of having such standards implemented and providing that framework within early childhood services across Australia, so that we have centres that are safe for our children, and also for workers and parents to have that sense of security, if you like, that if such
Yep.
matters come up, there is a proper framework to respond.
Yeah.
And that
Now,
increased awareness, I was just about to say that increased awareness also is in that workplace bullying area as well, because we've seen certainly increased claims in the last 10 years because of an increased awareness. And what we're seeing at the moment, which is interesting, is workforce shortages almost increasing the propensity of claims of workplace bullying, because I suppose putting it in everyday language, what I'm seeing a lot of is workers know that if an employer is not going to respond properly to genuine claims of workplace bullying, they will leave. They'll go to the next workplace, knowing full well they can get a job down the road, so to speak. So that those workforce shortages are almost putting extra pressure on claims, where in the past maybe we wouldn't have seen so many, because again, putting it in everyday
yep,
language, there'd be a
yep.
perception from the worker that there might be retribution for putting the hand up.
Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, and look, not that it's an excuse or anything like that, but when you look at the factors involved from COVID, as you said, staff shortages, the pressure and the stress on those management and that hierarchy must be huge.
Well, indeed, and it's really important from an employer point of view as well, that again, just because there's an allegation of workplace bullying doesn't mean that it's actually fits the definition under the Fair Work Act, for example, or the various workers' compensation schemes. There may be genuine managerial prerogative behind a
Yes.
decision that's been made that, again, putting it in everyday language, a worker may not like, but it doesn't
Yes.
necessarily equate to workplace bullying. So we've still got those principles there as well. Again, it goes back to what we've been touching on throughout this interview, is having a proper process for responding to such, so that we end up with a conclusion that's gone through a procedurally fair manner and is backed up or not by any available evidence.
And in fact, we've talked about a lot of the, like what would happen if I saw this, the educator saw this,
Mm.
report back to the employer. We can that what you've just talked about there, that employers aren't necessarily responding well to workplace bullying.
Mm.
Maybe on the flip side of that is, what would you tell an employer who's like may not know, or maybe dealing with something that doesn't allow them to respond in an appropriate manner?
Well, again, policies and procedures that we've spoken about, the grievance process in the relevant enterprise agreement or multi-employer agreement would be what would guide you in these responses, as well as seeking that advice from your relevant peak body, because again, as we've been touching on, regularly, there are obligations as far as responding to workplace bullying, because I'll paint a picture that I think would resonate with most employers. That if there's an allegation of workplace bullying and the employer takes a decision that assesses it themselves and says, okay, well, effectively, I think it's right, so I'm going to dismiss this person over there who I think is guilty of said workplace bullying.
Yeah.
If that person then lodges an unfair dismissal claim, what the Fair Work Commission will be looking at again, at risk of that broken record coming out, was the response of the employer done in a procedurally fair manner, and the decision of the employer based on that procedurally fair process. If the answer is no, the employer is going to have issues on their hands with the Fair Work Commission and that person making that claim. And the opposite applies, of course, as well. If the employer is able to say, we made this decision based on a procedurally fair process and with proper advice, as I said, the opposite applies. They're more likely to survive such scrutiny.
And of course, along the process, what really the employer, because we'll have employers from, who own single services, to own family daycares, early learning, preschool, kinders, right up to our corporate level, with boards and everything.
That's right. Yeah.
What you're really saying here is those employers that are unsure or not sure what to do, or are feeling like, I'll just get rid of that person. Before they do that, either call someone like you, call a peak body, talk to your union representative, get that advice before you jump in doing something that will not necessarily be good for you.
Well, that's right, absolutely. And, as we touched on before, a lot of what I see is motivated by goodwill. I mean, sometimes there's the odd person out there that wants to sweep it under the carpet, but in the main, we don't really see that. What we see more of is, what you were just touching on, a manager or a member of a committee of management or running in and basically saying, right, we need to respond to this because it's really serious. Let's do this, that, and the other, and inadvertently misstepping as far as that procedurally fair process is concerned.
Yeah, and that fair and procedurally fair process is then interrupted.
Well, indeed, and unfortunately, that can exacerbate the trauma for those involved.
And do you see that happen a lot, Nick?
Not a lot, no, because with the jobs that are sent my way, or whether through the peak body or directly through my website, there is a conversation that I will have with the client about the process, about the expectations. So there is that educative process, if you like.
Yep.
So I do sometimes see, processes where we have to go and clean up, so to speak. And that's what I was touching on before. In all seriousness, I know I smile as I say that, but in all seriousness, that can cause trauma because if a manager, a director of a service has done their own, local investigation, and then they get someone like me to come in and check, if there's been a misstep, we're almost going back to the start. We are going back to the start. So in a practical sense, an educator may have been interviewed by their employer about what they saw on a particular day. Someone like me might come in, I'll have to do that interview again because as part of my procedurally fair investigation, I'll look at the notes of the interview that was conducted by the employer, but to be a properly unbiased, independent interview, I'll have to do it from scratch, which effectively means that person's been interviewed twice.
Yeah, and depending, of course, there could be trauma attached to that.
Well, that indeed, and that's the point that I was just trying to emphasise, that there is usually...
Don't make them do it twice.
Most of the time there's trauma, whether we're talking reportable conduct or workplace bullying.
High emotions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, these are really great topics. I think it's such an important topic we talk about. But one of the things we like to ask all our guests is, looking forward, what are the big challenges facing the sector over the next few years that you see?
I touched on it slightly before, and I'll emphasise it again, and that's the workforce shortages. We've been talking about workforce shortages since the 1990s. I can remember PowerPoint displays, back then about predictions of workforce shortages, and yes, they have occurred, and they are increasing. So that's increasing the propensity I'm seeing of, especially in the workplace bullying space, more workers saying, you know what, enough's enough, I'm not going to put up with it, in the comfort of knowing that if their employer doesn't respond properly, There's plenty of jobs out there, and I'm putting it very simply, but that's a mindset that I'm seeing more and more of. Whereas you wouldn't say that 10 years ago. There'd be a bit more caution. And I think there's a greater awareness of rights as well. And as we touched on with the reportable conduct scheme, there's implementation of that national framework emanating from the Royal Commission has certainly increased awareness across the community, I would say,
Yeah.
but particularly in early childhood. So, employers need to be alert to those increased obligations and increased awareness of such obligations, which I'm sure we'd all agree is a good thing.
Yes. Oh, a good workplace. I am sure we've all worked. Well, I'm given our age. Sorry, Nick.
That's okay.
When you talk
I've
about
been
the
mentioning
nineties,
the
we're all
1990s.
we're all about the same.
Yeah.
Is that we've all worked in places back in those 90s where we saw, or were part of workplace bullying. The things that happened just wouldn't happen now. So the good out of it is we're all in a much better space workplace wise and getting a job and being supported and professionally and personally, really.
Well, indeed. And another thing, just when you mentioned that sort of period of time, back in the 90s or the noughties, so to speak, a lot of allegations of workplace bullying, and if we just focus on, just keep it on that for a minute, were responded to by the organisation. And some responses were great, some were not so great, some in between. What happened over time is some of these cases ended up in the courts. So that's
Yes.
where this obligation of procedural fairness has been emphasised, and has had a significant ripple effect, as you can imagine, amongst human resource management and industrial relations professionals such as myself.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it's like, and that's the good thing out of it. Hopefully, we see less court cases. Hopefully, we see better procedural fairness. Hopefully, we see better outcomes. Really, right down to for our children's sake and that
Well,
next
indeed,
generation
absolutely.
coming along.
Well, absolutely. And it comes down to whether, I suppose, we're sending our children to a service, we expect them to be in a safe place, or if we're a worker working in a service, in such a service, we expect to work in a safe place as well. So it really comes down to those simple principles.
Absolutely. Oh no, it says can only be good. Um, Now, before we finish up, we like to ask our wonderful guests, and I do appreciate you joining me. I know it's been a road to get us here, Nick, as
No, no,
well.
indeed, indeed.
What do you have any, like, I call them wise words or a motto, a motivational quote that you'd like to share with us?
And thank you for your patience in this interview. And it's been taken about 6 months to get here. It's a reflection of how busy I am in early childhood. But
Yeah, I know,
look,
and that's the thing.
I contemplated this question when you sent it to me, and I think this comes down to values, my values, and I suppose my love of industrial relations. It's a profession that I've been pretty much in my whole working life, um, and it relates to my value set. It is a quote by Winston Churchill, so maybe a bit corny for some people, but I think it reflects the world of work, why I'm in it, and that is we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give.
Ah, that's fantastic. I've not. No one's come up with a Winston Churchill quote yet, so no, that's fantastic.
I'm a bit of a mild fanatic with history, so maybe that's where it comes
Okay.
from.
No, but it's a great quote. Actually, it's very much about what we talked about today.
Well, it's about the substance, it's about the quality, it's about the fact that we all work, but effectively, what are we contributing to this? I don't want to get too sort of esoteric, but this life that we have.
Yeah. Well, look, Nick, you're in industrial relations that impacts the early learning sector. I'm in a software solution called One Place. Right. All about we're all here doing what we can for the good of our generation of children coming through, but also supporting those from that birth right through to our the employer, the owner, the approved provider. It's all
Yes,
about supporting them to support those children.
indeed.
Wonderful.
Couldn't
Look,
agree
thank
more.
you so much for your time. It's been
Thanks, Paula.
as much as it was serious. It was actually a very much needed podcast, but so much fun talking with you as well.
It's been great talking to you, Paula. Thank you.
Wonderful.